Initially, I set up some study questions. These are just basically, there's only 2 slides, so it should be okay. So, I set up about 10 questions, but these questions are basically to facilitate for you to read it. So just to now look at my 5th question from thesis and antithesis type formulation. Synthesis could arise, but the author says that as a result dialectic was born. Why synthesis could not be the solution to the Buddha? Now when you read this, you can think about some of these questions, because usually when we talk about the thesis and antithesis, and then usually what comes in the, say, according to philosophers like Hegel, what comes is a synthesis. Synthesis is a combination of both views and something that comes up, something as a better view. But then interesting thing is, as a result of encounter between thesis and antithesis, T.R.V. Murthy says, not the synthesis, but dialectic was born. So the question is why synthesis could not be the solution to the Buddha. Now synthesis as you take 2 opposite views, and then the 2 opposite views ultimately combining and coming together, and then something considered to be better coming out of the combination. But of course here you can see thesis and antithesis is there, but of course not the synthesis but the dialectic. I think when we try to understand this whole process, we also have to understand what the dialectic is. Now dialectic or dialectics sometimes is used, or dialectical process is something to do with always, it has a general meaning. Dialectic means a logical investigation. So it can be logical investigation, but here dialectic mean some kind of higher way of thinking which goes beyond the thesis and the antithesis, or critiquing both thesis and antithesis. So it is not mere logical process, okay? So dialectic as critiquing of the views. So ultimately, according to writers like T.R.V. Murthy, dialectic itself becoming the philosophical method and the philosophical process. So go back and read about dialectic little bit. I mean dictionary meaning and also the application, okay? Because that is very important for you to understand what is spoken of about here. So I have this, the 5th question is from thesis and antithesis type formulation. Synthesis could arise, but the author says that as a result dialectic was born. My question is why synthesis could not be the solution to the Buddha. Another example would be, even if you take middle path, Majjhima Patipada. Now you know that Majjhima Patipada is not a combination of 2 extremes. Okay, Majjhima Patipada means you transcend, you go beyond the extremes. So usually people understand Majjhima Patipada as English term is there, you have heard via media. Via media is the between 2 extremes you follow the middle path, like neither too much of this nor too much of this. Now that's via media means actually it's not the Majjhima Patipada. Via media is a combination of 2. You take some from this end, some from this end, and then you form some middle path. So if you take Kamasukallika Yoga and Attakilamata Yoga, you can say that not as much as Kamasukallika Yoga, not much Attakilamata Yoga, something in between. But the Majjhima Patipada is not that. Very often in the ordinary society, I think this comes in the Aristotle's philosophy, via media, like between extremes, you tread the middle path. Neither too much of this, nor too much of that. Now, Majjhima Patipada is more like what is spoken here as dialectic. Okay, it goes beyond, it transcends both ends. Okay, so that's one way to think. But it is important for you to, useful for you to go to the dictionary or Wikipedia maybe to read what dialectic means. And another set of questions will be question number 6. What is the Abhidharmakosha interpretation of Avyakrita? Is it different from the Pali analysis? If so, how? Now this, of course, we read this part last week, Abhidharmakosha analysis. And then Abhidharmakosha analysis, we found that it was not exactly like Pali. Because in the Pali discourse, Buddha gives only one reason. Buddha says these 10 questions are not relevant to attain nirvana. That's all. Netang na nibbidaya, na viragaya, na upasamaya, na aviññaya, na sambodhaya, na nibbānaya samvata. That's all. But in Abhidharmakosha, you could see that the different the responses by the Buddha or not answering the question was, on the one hand, looking at the mentality of the listener, his state of mind, his capacity. So all those things are there, but those things are basically not mentioned in the Pali discourses. Then question number 7, the author says, Buddha is alive, unlike other philosophers, to the insuperable difficulties in conceiving the transcendent in terms of the empirical. What do you understand by this statement? So that's basically, again, we read this section, page, based on page 44 last week. So author says Buddha is alive, unlike other philosophers, to the insuperable difficulties. Insuperable means insurmountable, that very difficult to pass. Conceiving the transcendent in terms of empirical. So the transcendent is an empirical. Now the interesting thing is, according to this view, Buddha believed in something called transcendent, something lokuttara. Now, in my own research, I have tried to show that although the concept of lokuttara used in Buddhism, that lokuttara is different from the concept of, we are speaking on Hinduism and Western theological language, the transcendent. Lokuttara has a different meaning, okay? So it is not exactly as transcendent. So here, according to T.R.V. Murthy, the Buddha was alive to the difficulties of talking about the transcendent through the empirical. So the empirical means something you can see from your senses. Transcendent means that which transcends. So usually when you have transcendent T capital, what you mean is either God or some kind of that type of either concept, Brahman or Atman or God, something like that. It is very interesting, these Hindu philosophers. Now T.R.V. Murthy is basically Hindu philosopher, Vedanta. It is very easy for them to interpret Christianity and all the God-centered religious traditions together with Hinduism. So Hinduism kind of in between. It can go to Buddhist side and also incorporate certain things, and it can go to the transcendental aspect of religion and go to absorb it, So Hindu interpretation of religion is actually, we need to be very careful to understand, because that understanding Now, one good example is T.R.V. Murthy, because when you see T.R.V. Murthy, you can see that basic interpretation comes from interpreting the Buddhist concept in the Hindu way of thinking. So, now for the Hindu philosopher, both theistic concept of transcendent and the non-theistic concept of transcendent, both are familiar. Because in Advaita Vedanta, you have Brahman. But Brahman is what is called Apaurusheya. Apaurusheya means it has nothing to do with the person. It is an impersonal concept. And on the other hand, in the Western tradition, you have the concept of God. Okay? So, personal and impersonal. So, when you say God, the God is, and then when you say Brahman, now this is, this is what is called impersonal, and this is personal. So you can say transcendent personal, transcendent impersonal. Now, basically, philosophers like T.R.V. Murthy want to put Nirvana and in this category. So Nirvana is impersonal transcendent, something like Brahman. So ultimate, the principle. Now this is the personal transcendent, this impersonal transcendent. So when you read these texts, the secondary literature written by, particularly when you read texts like Indian scholars like Radhakrishnan, T.R.V. Murthy and many others, even today, Indian scholars have this difficulty, because difficulty in the sense they, in a way we can say that don't want to read Buddhism as anything different from Hinduism. That's the problem. They don't want to accept that Buddhism to be different from Hinduism. So somehow or other, now T.R.V. Murthy is a good example for that. So now when you, so that viewpoint still continues, because Buddhism has a continuation of Hinduism. I mean, we don't want to go into detail of that view, but anyhow, this is basically how they want to locate it. So Buddha is alive, unlike philosophers. They are alive means Buddha is aware to the insuperable difficulties in conceiving transcendent in terms of empirical. Now, interestingly, here he says the Buddhism also has a concept of transcendental. Now, we have one problem here. The problem is when we talk Buddhism, when we say Buddhism, we also have to define what Buddhism we are talking. Because if you take some Mahayana concept, of course some Mahayana concepts have a very similar concept of Buddha. Particularly if you take concept of Amitabha Buddha. I mean, Amitabha Buddha is like a living God. So therefore, when we talk about Buddhism, we also, there is a need to define what Buddhism we are talking about. Because sometimes when it comes to this kind of things, it is not very easy to talk as if Buddhism is all one. But there are other areas like ethics and, similar areas, behavior. We can talk about Buddhism in general. In overall philosophy also we can talk about Buddhism in general, but there are certain things like here, there are very interesting and important differences. So you will have to also define what Buddhism is also. That's the interesting thing. Number 8, was the Buddha silent about the Avyakuta questions? How do you understand the silence of the Buddha? The author says that the close parallel to Buddha's treatment of these questions is Neti of Upanishads. That page 48, we will be reading that part today. Last question I have given is in the last section, section 7. The author refers to several discourses as anticipating the Madhyamaka position in the discourses. Identify them and develop your own comments on them. So actually the author seems to think that, the early Buddhist teachings are very close to Madhyamaka. So he refers to certain teachings. Now it is very interesting when we study Buddhist history. It is very important for us to see different periods by different scholars. History of Buddhism is read in somewhat different manners. Now, for example, say several decades ago, Nagarjuna was read by people as representing basically emptiness, Shunyatavada, and also Vasubandhu was read as representing Vijnanavada. Now, these views were considered to be completely different from basic teachings of the Buddha. But by now, not actually by now, but for the last 20-25 years, the scholars have changed those views. Now, according to the scholars like, say, A.K. Warder, Kalupahana, and many others, and also people like, again, Kalupahana also studied so-called Vijnanavada, Vijnapti Matrata Siddhi, and there are many others who studied. So they think that, the interpretation so far we had is wrong. So they have a new interpretation. So at some point, Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika was believed to very different philosophy. But today, people like Kalupahana have interpreted, even I myself, I have interpreted it as it goes very much along with the basic discourses of the Buddha. So now in that sense, T.R.V. Murthy is also like that. He thinks that Madhyamaka philosophy is close to Buddhism. But on the other hand, his difference is, he thinks that ultimately Buddha is talking about transcendental state called Nirvana. We also say Nibbana is Lokuttara. But if you analyze the concept of Lokuttara, particularly in the text like Patisambhida Magga, you can see in what sense Buddhism uses the concept Lokuttara. So the Western concept of transcendent, where T is capital, and the Lokuttara concept of Buddhism are different. So, you really need to carefully read these texts to understand. Now, particularly, I would like to tell you, because Burmese scholarship, like if you take the Burmese in this country, the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist scholarship is very great. But one thing I don't see is, the Burmese scholarship is not extended into the many other aspects of the Buddhist studies. That is very important. You need to go to the other aspects of Buddhist studies. Okay? Burmese, the scholarship has to go to Sanskrit, go to Tibetan, go to Chinese. There is a need to go beyond, because we need to study our own tradition. But at the same time, we need to also look at other Buddhist traditions, other philosophical traditions, Hindu tradition, and so that, we can know it in a comparative basis. Otherwise, we know our text, we know our commentaries, we know our sub-commentaries. That's good. We need to know that. But at some point, we need to go beyond these things and to read, particularly the history of Buddhism, very own Theravada history, how the ideas gradually develop. So there is a need to the Burmese scholarship, because traditionally, if you take a community of people, Buddhist monks and Buddhist nuns can be the most educated community. If you take entire community, literacy rate can be 99%, 9 point, right? So you can say that most literate community in the world, if you really look at it. But that literacy has to go beyond Buddhist studies. Ultimately, it will help. It will help you to, present Buddhist studies and understand Buddhist studies, present it to the world, okay? So particularly need to go to the other languages. Some of the monks need to read Chinese, really, classical Chinese, That's very important. Why Western world has gone beyond us in the Buddhist scholarship is because, they have done all these things. We are only doing the traditional things. Even in Sri Lanka situation is that. But, in comparable, I can see that, the textual scholarship is much higher in this country, but still then we need to go to other languages, Sanskrit. I mean, I wish I knew Tibetan and classical Chinese, but I don't know. Basically, we studied Sanskrit, and then I studied to some extent French and German languages, but in French and German languages there are so many Buddhist texts. Not only that, if you take Japanese language, I think in Japanese language is the language in which largest number of Buddhist publications come every year. Largest number of Buddhist publications every year. So, if you know Japanese, you can do a lot. Of course, one person can't do all these things, but there must be experts in Japanese, there must be experts in Tibetan, there must be experts in Chinese, there must be experts in Sanskrit. So, in one university, in one academy, if you have these experts in different things, suppose we had here that type of experts, then our discussion is going to be in a different level. Because somebody is in a position to say, okay, this is how classical Chinese Sarvastivada texts say. We don't have that. And somebody can say, this is what the Tibetan texts say. So, this is really a huge challenge we have in future. Because German texts are not being translated into other very much. So, we need to read German, French, in the modern languages, German, French, and English, basically, at least. And then, of course, Asian languages, modern Japanese, and then classical Chinese, things like that. So, also being able to write in English language is very important because people usually don't study Sinhala language or Burmese language in order to read Buddhism. So, whatever we write, if we can also write in English, it is good. Anyhow, so these are some of the issues we have when it comes to the interpretation of Buddhism. So, T.R.V. Murthy's interpretation is interesting. It ultimately says that Madhyamika is, very much similar to the early discourses. But the interesting thing is, T.R.V. Murthy comes to that conclusion for certain reasons. But people like Kalupahan and A.K. Voda have come to that conclusion on different reasons. Okay, although the conclusion is the same, their reasons given different. So we need to be, aware of these things. So these 10 study questions are basically for you to, for your own study. So we have first 5 questions. So maybe these other questions are more important and relevant for us today. So we will read this starting from page 47. We read up to page 47 in the middle. Section number 6. The true nature of Buddha's silence. Now this concept of Buddha's silence, that's a figurative concept. T.R.V. Murthy is the one who introduced. He thinks that Buddha was silent. Actually, we have to understand this as a figurative concept because Buddha was not silent, okay? Buddha was not silent. Even about the unanswered questions, Buddha did not answer. But that doesn't mean he kept his mouth shut. He said why he does not answer, why the questions are not necessary. So he talked. But only thing is silence is he did not answer them in a positive yes and no manner. Now in that sense we can say Buddha is silent, okay? But not that he was really completely mum about it or something. The Buddha's silence then cannot be construed as agnosticism. Cannot be construed. Construe means you construct somebody's view. You interpret somebody's view as agnosticism. So he says that Buddha was silent, or Buddha did not answer these questions due to agnostic reasons. Actually, agnosticism means Again, look at dictionary, look at Wikipedia or something. It's very important to know these implications. Agnosticism is basically to accept that we cannot know certain, the things like concept of God or things like that. It's beyond our knowledge. We cannot know these things. Agnosticism, interestingly, different from atheism. Atheism say there is no God. Agnosticism would say that they wouldn't say there is no God, they would say we don't know. So, this is the basic difference between the two traditions. So, agnostics would not say that there is no God, but instead they would say we don't know. It is beyond our, the capacity. Now, 4, this is an attitude in doubt and despair. So, according to T.R.V. Murthy, attitude of doubts and despair. What is that? Attitude of doubt and despair. Despair means despondency. Now, those are the words he used, agnosticism. Agnosticism is an attitude of doubt and despair. But Buddha's answer is decisive. Buddha's answer is decisive. Buddha's answer is conclusive in the sense, Buddha did not, it doesn't mean that Buddha they kept in silent or something. When Buddha said that for these reasons Buddha would not answer, it is decisive. It is not also true that Buddha's attitude was just a suspension of judgment, that he was waiting for a more favorable opportunity to publish the truth. Suspension of judgment means you don't draw a conclusion. You don't draw a conclusion. You simply postpone making a decision. That is what is called suspension of the judgment. Now, you suspend judgment means you do not draw a conclusion simply because maybe the matters at hand are not enough, or you can wait for some more reasons to be gathered, or for any reason, you do not draw a conclusion. That is suspension. Now, this is Buddha's, according to him, Buddha's attitude was just, it's not true that his was just a suspension of judgment, and that he was waiting for a more favorable opportunity to publish the truth. He tells us expressly means very clearly, very pointedly, that he has taught the truth without reservation and without any distinction of exoteric and esoteric. Without any distinction of exoteric and esoteric. Now, these two terms are used when usually people study religion. Exoteric. Exoteric means external. Esoteric means internal. Exoteric, external, esoteric, internal. Now, when social scientists study religion, they say that in religions you have what is external or what you can see from outside. Esoteric means what is internal, that means only open for initiated, only open for few people. Like, if you take a religion, in a religion you have public performances. People come, people take part in the rites and rituals with the public speakers, going in the processions on the road, and thousands of people do things collectively. Those things are called exoteric. Okay? But then there are kind of things esoteric. Now, say, example, when you go to Uposatha, ordinary people are not allowed, right? Even Samaneras are not allowed. So, it's only among the Upasampada. So, in a way, we can say that is esoteric, that is more internal. Only it is open only for members. So, in religion, they say that, I just gave you that as an example, but there can be things which are public and also which are less public and more limited to a group of people. So, that is esoteric. So, here he says, Buddha taught the truth without reservation and without any distinction of exoteric and esoteric. He had not kept back anything like a tight-fisted teacher. Tight-fisted teacher means actually this comes in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. What is the Pali term for this? Tight-fisted teacher. Pardon me? Acharya Mutti. Very good. Acharya Mutti. Mutti means fist. You know, you hide something. Now, whole concept of Upanishad, if you take Upanishad means Upanishad. You sit very close to your teacher and, you learn from the teacher certain secrets. So, Upanishads are not public. Upanishads are not given in a public. Now, of course, Upanishad texts are printed, but originally Upanishads are meant to be very confidentially some exchange between the teacher and the most trusted student. Upanishad. Now, in Buddhism, there are no Upanishads. There are no Acharya Mutti. Acharya Mutti, teacher's fist. Nor is it ignorance of metaphysics. And also, you cannot construe the Buddha's position as ignorance of metaphysics. He was not only conversant with philosophical speculations of the time. Conversant. He was conversant means he was very much knowledgeable. Conversant with philosophical speculations of the time. But was himself a metaphysician of no mean order. He was a metaphysician of no mean order. Mean order means average. No mean order means he is not an average metaphysician. He is, according to Murthy, much greater metaphysician. But was himself a metaphysician of no mean order. By his penetrate means something that goes through something, penetrate. So penetrative analysis means very sharp analysis. He had reached a position which transcended and annulled. Annulled means negated the dogmatic procedure of reason. So he reached the position in which he annulled or he denied, he rejected the dogmatic procedure of reason. Dogmatic procedure of reason means reasoning has a certain accepted, approved way, so he has gone beyond that. His rejection of speculative metaphysics was deliberate and sustained. So his rejection of speculative metaphysics is deliberate. Buddha did that deliberately. And also sustained. He did it fully. Criticism itself is philosophy for him. Now he says that for the Buddha, criticism itself is philosophy. Criticism is the philosophy. But then here we don't really necessarily have to agree, because Murthy is attributing a position to the Buddha. According to that position, for the Buddha, criticism is the philosophy. Buddha's like what Nagarjuna did, what we saw in the morning, like, critiquing and criticizing the view is, but whether it is so or not, we have to decide based on our knowledge, okay? Now, this is why we need to read these things and then think accordingly. Simply because T.R.V. Murthy says, simply because he is such a great writer and scholar, you don't have to accept it, right? So we need to. His position was not nihilism, even in an implicit form. His position is not nihilism. Nihilism means, now, agnosticism means to say that you don't know these things and they are beyond, they could be or they could not be. But nihilism is different. Nihilism is to deny or reject all the positive aspects of religion. That is nihilism. So there is an important distinction between agnosticism and nihilism. Now, agnostic is a person who believes that there are certain things you cannot know. It's some kind of skepticism, really. But the nihilism is to deny everything. Nothing is worthwhile. Nothing is valuable in a religion. So that's a nihilistic. I mean, it's a very negative thing. Okay. I think it will be a good exercise for you to make a survey on skepticism, agnosticism, and nihilism. Write down on your own notes what is the difference between the three concepts: skepticism, nihilism, agnosticism. Just read, if you don't have anything better, at least you can read Wikipedia. So you can see, don't accept everything in Wikipedia, but be careful, but still you can read Wikipedia for these things. There are some very important distinctions between these two. His position was not nihilism, even in an implicit form. Neither Buddha nor any Buddhistic system ever took this to be so. So not only Buddha, even any Buddhist tradition has never taken to this nihilistic standpoint. Buddha avers in the most explicit terms the existence of nirvana as the implication of his doctrine and the spiritual discipline. Buddha avers in the most explicit terms the existence of nirvana as the implication of his doctrine and the spiritual discipline. Numerous are the passages in which nirvana is spoken in positive terms as a reality beyond all suffering and change, as unfading, still undecaying, taintless, as peace, blissful, and so on. So, neither Buddha nor any Buddhistic system ever took this to be so. Buddha avers in the most explicit terms the existence of nirvana as the implication of his doctrine and the spiritual discipline. Now, the Buddha avers in the most explicit term, in very clear terms, the existence of nirvana as the implication of his doctrine and the spiritual discipline. So Buddha really affirms, Buddha really asserts that nirvana is really existing. As a result of his following his spiritual discipline. And in other words, he is saying that nihilism or the non-existence of nirvana is not to be the position. That has never been a position. So nihilism is never a position for Buddhism. Now, I think Murthy's comment comes from some people have criticized Nagarjuna as a nihilist. Okay, so Nagarjuna as a nihilist. Now he wants to, I think Murthy is trying to counter that. Nagarjuna is not a nihilist. Like Buddha is also not a nihilist. So he confirms, he asserts that nirvana is there. Numerous are the passages in which nirvana is spoken of in positive terms. So nirvana is not a negative thing. Buddha talks. There are many places in the teaching of the Buddha, nirvana is spoken in positive terms. As a reality beyond all suffering and change. Nirvana is a reality beyond all suffering and change. Still means unmoving, calm, undecaying. It doesn't decay or it doesn't, go decaying and finally, ending. So undecayed, taintless. It doesn't have any taints. Taints means defilements, bad characteristics. It is a peace. It is blissful. It is an island. It's a shelter, the refuge, and the goal. Now these are some of the adjectives or the metaphors that are used by the Buddha in order to describe nirvana. So T.R.V. Murthy want to say that this is not nihilism. Nirvana is not a nihilistic state. It is a positive state. In a celebrated Udana passage, number 2, Udana page 80 and 81, Iti Uttaka page 37 and page 62. Now these are references to the Pali text, society text. In a celebrated Udana passage, Buddha says, there is a not born, not become, not created, not formed. If there were not this not born, this not become, there would not be the escape, the way out from this bondage, samsara. Now, you know, this Udana passage is very interesting. Among the Buddhist scholars, Udana is in English language abbreviated as U, right? U. And then I read this book. It is a fairly old book now. Rune Johansson, who wrote the book called Psychology of Nirvana. The name of the text is Psychology of Nirvana. I think you can download this, a very old book now, about 50 years old now. There is an interesting chapter. That chapter is U80. Now, U80 means Udana 80. Because in the PTS text, U80 means Udana page 80. Now, Udana page 80 refers to this sutta. Buddha says there is a not born, not become, not created, not formed. What are the Pali terms of this? Not born, not become, not created, not formed. What is not born? Ajata. Ajata, abhuta, akata, asankata. Ajata, abhuta, akata, asankata. And Buddha says, Atti bhikkave ajatang abhutang akatang asankatang. Atti bhikkave ajatang abhutang akatang asankatang. Udana 80, U80 is a very well-known reference. So, Atti bhikkave ajatang abhutang akatang asankatang. Then Buddha says, if ajata, abhuta, akata, asankata was not there, there will not be escape from jata, bhuta, kata, sankhata. Now, you know, this T.R.V. Murthy discusses this sutta, and he refers to this nirvana as a reality. The Buddha did not doubt the reality of nirvana. Now, there you see in absolute, in brackets, he used the word absolute. Now, you see here, the real difficulty is here. According to T.R.V. Murthy, nirvana is the absolute. Now, when you describe something as ajata, abhuta, akata, asankata, you know, okay, you describe it as absolute, A capital. Now, the same thing, transcendental, T capital, absolute, A capital. Now, what you mean by these things is, you know, basically something, a transcendental phenomenon. Actually, in my own book, Nirvana and Ineffability, I have commented and criticized on this view in a fairly lengthy manner, because I don't accept this to be correct. But that's a different thing. We will try to understand T.R.V. Murthy here. Buddha did not doubt the reality of nirvana. Only he would not allow us to characterize and clothe it in empirical terms as being, non-being, etc. So according to T.R.V. Murthy, Buddha did not doubt the existence of absolute. Only thing he did not do was to clothe it, to dress it, or to impose on it empirical terms, being, not being, etc. His silence can only be interpreted as meaning the consciousness of the indescribable nature of unconditioned reality. So his silence is because the indescribable nature, you cannot describe indescribable nature of the unconditioned reality. So the nirvana is the unconditioned reality. So it's kind of very interesting, because what you see is all the conditioned reality. This world is conditioned, sanskara dharma, Sanskrita. Tables, chairs, human beings, buildings and everything is sanskara dhamma. So, sabbe sankhara anicca. All the sanskaras are impermanent. So, it is true that, you know, even the Buddhist teachers did not want to categorize nirvana in that. But on the other hand, when you describe nirvana in these terms, of course, you know, the nirvana becomes a transcendentally existing, you know, thing. So his silence can only be interpreted as meaning the consciousness of the indescribable nature of the unconditioned reality. Now then he refers to Professor Radhakrishnan. Unerringly indicates the nature of Buddha's silence in his works thus. So he refers to Radhakrishnan. Now, actually Radhakrishnan is very well known for saying that Buddhism is a branch of Upanishadic philosophy. It's kind of very interesting to see, even up to today, most of the Indian scholars accept that view. So they cannot. I know that, there are many Indian Buddhist scholars. They simply go by this Radhakrishnan view. Okay, we will see what it is. If the Buddha declined to define the nature of the Absolute, or if he contented himself with negative definitions, it is only to indicate that Absolute Being is above all determinations. So, according to Radhakrishnan, Buddha did not describe Absolute Being because it is beyond all the determination. Determinations means characterizations. Why then did the Buddha not admit and express terms the reality of the Absolute? Then you can ask a question, why Buddha did not accept it in express terms, very clear terms, the reality of the Absolute, that Nirvana really exists. Buddha refused to describe the Absolute, or that would be to take a step out of the world of relativity, the legitimacy of which he was the first to contest in others. Now, read it again. The Buddha refused to describe the Absolute, for that would be to take a step out of the world of relativity, the legitimacy of which he was the first to contest in others. Now that is to take a step, the world out of the world of relativity, and Buddha really had questioned the legitimacy of this world of relativity. So according to Radhakrishnan, Buddha did not accept the relative existence of the empirical world. Absolute is not a matter of empirical observation. Absolute cannot be viewed from empirical observation. The world of experience does not reveal the Absolute anywhere within its limit. So world of experience means our world, our experience. So in our experiential world, Absolute Nirvana is not found. Okay? Now, you have to study these views very carefully. And what comes into my mind is, there are so many discourses and the Theratherigathas where they talk about Nirvana as realized in this very life. Now, you can see whether that type of evidence whether goes along with this, okay? But anyhow, those things are further you to do. We are just trying to read T.R.V. Murthy. A close parallel, as is pointed out by many scholars, is the Upanishadic way of defining Brahman as Neti Neti. Now, this is something very interesting. In the Upanishads, Brahman is, when it comes to describe Brahman, the language is called Neti Neti. Neti means Neti Neti. It means na iti. Na iti means not so. So idea is that whenever somebody asks about Brahman, Upanishadic philosophy seems to be saying, what they can say is this Brahman? You can say no. Is this Brahman? You can say no. Is this Brahman? You can say no. Then, as to what is Brahman, you don't know. So, only thing you can do is you can say which is not Brahman. According to this view, Buddha did the same thing. Buddha did the same thing. When it was asked, Buddha used the word Nirvana in the negative terms, not in the positive terms. I mean, you can say what Nirvana is not, but not what Nirvana is. So, this Upanishadic concept is sometimes brought into Buddhism to say that Buddha also used something like Neti Neti. Now, this Neti Neti view is in Sanskrit language. In Latin language, in the Western tradition, we have via negativa. Via negativa. Via means the road or the path. Vaya negativa means the negative path or the negative road. So because this same idea is found in the Western tradition also. You cannot say what God is, but you can say what God is not. So the negative language. So we can see both East and also in the West, people had this view that, this transcendental reality cannot be described in the known language. You cannot characterize it in the positive terms. Only thing you can do is describe it, characterize it to show what it is not. Now, this idea of neti or vaya negativa is quite logical if you accept something to be transcendental. By definition, transcendental things don't belong in here. Okay? So if it doesn't belong in here, then of course you can't use the ordinary human language. So the idea is that, the transcendental, even though in somehow other manner you realize it, you can't say it. Because the language is so, there are so many ideas about it. Again, we don't want to go into that debate. But basically the idea is, what I'm saying is, if you believe that something is totally transcendental, then of course it's natural that you cannot talk about it. So vaya negativa, neti, all those are kind of interpretation of that. But then again, the problem is whether Nirvana, Buddha has said that Nirvana is something like that. Okay? So, that is something we need to think about more in our own reflections. But here this neti is the Upanishadic view when it comes to defining Brahman as what cannot be grasped by speech, thought or senses. There is a very famous Upanishadic statement, Yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha. Yato vacho nivartante, from which point, vacho nivartante aprapya. The word stops without being able to go there. Aprapya manasa saha. Your mind also cannot go there. So this is a very well-known statement in the Upanishad. Yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha. So the word cannot go there, your mind cannot go there. So that means you cannot think about it, you cannot also talk about it. Of course, if you cannot think about something, you cannot talk about it, right? If you cannot think about something, you cannot talk about that thing. But anyhow, so as we cannot be grasped by speech, thought and senses, Brahman is nirdharmaka. Now look at that term. Brahman is nirdharmaka. Asthulam, ananu, etc. Now T.R.V. Murthy uses these Sanskrit terms which are coming in Sanskrit religious texts. Nirdharmaka. So the Brahman doesn't have dharma. Dharma means nature or characteristic of the worldly. So nirdharmaka, it doesn't have dharma. It doesn't have phenomenal aspect. Asthulam. Thulam, sthulam, asthulam. It doesn't have a shape or size. Ananu, ne anu. Anu means the atom or atomic state. Ananu means there is no atomic state. Ananu. Devoid of determination. Determinations are, the characteristics of things. So you don't have any right, short, long, big, small, any determinations are not there. Far from being unreal on this account, it is the sole reality, the soul of the universe. Now, it is not really unreal. It is the sole reality. It is the only that is really real. And also it is the soul of the universe. It is the soul of the universe. While indescribability of the absolute is common to the Upanishads and the Buddha. So he thinks that both the Buddha and the Upanishads subscribe to the view of indescribability of the absolute. A difference in the approach must be admitted. Now, T.R.V. Murthy says, although indescribability is common to both Upanishads and the Buddha believe that absolute cannot be described. But difference in their approach has to be expected. So he says that although in believing that absolute is indescribable, both Upanishad and Buddha are the same, there must be difference in the approach. The Upanishadic seers do not concern themselves with the different philosophical standpoints and views of the real. Now, Upanishadic seers were not very much concerned about different philosophical standpoints and views of the real. Being pioneers in the field, they had not before them many right or wrong views to criticize and to condemn. So, the reason according to T.R.V. Murthy is Upanishadic philosophers were very early. So when they were philosophizing, they did not have many views in front of them, either to accept or either to reject. So they were almost pioneers. They appear to start with an intuitive and extra philosophical knowledge of Brahman. So they seem to be, their starting point is intuitive. Now, the noun behind that is intuition. Intuition is something that you feel. It's like gut feeling. You can't explain what it is. Intuition, even today that word is used. If you feel something, but you don't know how you feel, then it is called intuition. Sometimes say you feel something bad about something. You feel that something very bad will happen. Maybe within several minutes or something, you get a very bad news that someone is dead or something. So that's a kind of intuition, you know. You don't know how it came. So that type of thing is called intuitive. Or extra philosophical knowledge, that knowledge goes beyond philosophy of Brahman. And then lead the disciple to what knowledge through arguments and analogies. So they did not have this way to lead the disciple to the knowledge through arguments and analogies. They are not aware, they are not aware except in a vague form of the conflict in reason. So they were not aware except in a very vague form. They had some vague ideas of the conflict in reason. Conflict in reason means when you go through the reasoning process, ultimately the reasoning process stops at some point, being unable to go. Now even in that Upanishadic statement, yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasasaha, your mind cannot go. Now usually rational thinking is done by your mind. So your mind cannot go means you can interpret this as rational thinking. So the conflict in reason. So according to T.R.V. Murthy, conflict in reason, he uses this term from Immanuel Kant, okay? Immanuel Kant used this concept. He thought that when ordinary people, through ordinary, their language, experience, try to understand God, he thought that, that is something you cannot do. So the conflict in reason. So ultimately reason faces conflict. So in that conflicting situation, the reasoning goes many different directions. So the conflict in reason. Theirs is not a dialectical approach. Theirs means the Upanishadic philosophers is not a dialectical approach. The Buddha, on the other hand, is more rational in his procedure. Now, Buddha, on the other hand, is more rational in his procedure. He starts with the total and interminable conflict. Interminable means unending conflict in reason, as exemplified in several speculative systems of his time. So Buddha's time is different. By the Buddha's time, there were many philosophical traditions. So Buddha start with them, unlike Upanishadic people. Upanishadic philosophers didn't have so many views in front of them, but the Buddha is different. Okay, we'll take a short break from here and we will gather again 5 minutes to continue reading. Okay. So where have all gone? Okay, we continue reading page 49. The untenability of each view, of all views, condemns them as mere subjective devices. The rejection of theories, ditti, is itself the means by which the Buddha is led to the non-conceptual knowledge of the Absolute, and not vice versa. Now, we will go back to the early sentence, last sentence. He starts with the total and interminable conflict of reason. Now, I refer to this concept of conflict in reason. Conflict in reason means, the inability of reason to go beyond certain limits, as exemplified in the several speculative systems in his time. So speculative systems means different views belonging to time of the Buddha. So these views ultimately end up not being able to really convince the people, because from reasoning process you can't reach the necessary conclusion. The untenability of each view. Untenability of each view. Now, each view is not tenable, means cannot be held. Untenability. That means unsustainability or unsupportability of each view. Of all views, condemns them as mere subjective devices. Subjective devices means certain devices we have made in order for our own convenience. Subjective, they are very personal. The rejection of theories, it is itself the means by which the Buddha is led to the non-conceptual knowledge of the Absolute. So in fact what he says is, by rejecting all the views, ultimately Buddha reached the non-conceptual knowledge of the Absolute. What is this non-conceptual knowledge? Now this is something very interesting to think about. Usually our knowledge is through concepts, right? Now that is why when we say that we know something, usually we can say that because we have a concept behind it. Yeah? So the knowledge is usually conceptual knowledge. Now in philosophy, sometimes people talk about non-conceptual knowledge. There is some knowledge which is not conceptual. That means which cannot be put in concepts or linguistic concepts. Now, when we say conceptual, we are talking about the psychological aspect of language. Like the concept can have a more psychological thing. Now the word is what comes out from our mouth, which is common. So now we have a concept in our mind first, before something comes up from our mouth. So the concept. So usually we have conceptual framework, and then from that words come out. Now philosophers sometimes held the view that there is some kind of knowledge which is non-conceptual. Now, again, in my own book, Nirvana and Ineffability, I have examined this view because, honestly speaking, this concept doesn't make much sense to me because, when you say you know something, but for you to say that you know something, but that you cannot say it, that you cannot conceptualize it, is a fairly strange statement. Because if you know something, whenever you say, I know something, it must have some kind of way to say that what you know. So the language and knowledge are very much closely linked. Okay? Now, non-conceptual knowledge means that there is a particular knowledge which is not conceptually articulated. Now, it is a very interesting position. If you say non-conceptual knowledge, then you can ask what is that knowledge? I mean, you can give an answer, well, I can't say it. Because non-conceptual means there are no concepts, there are no words. Now, this idea is fairly, again, common to religions. You remember a few minutes ago I quoted Upanishadic statement, Yato vacho nivartante, aprapya manasa saha. Yato vacho nivartante. Vacho means vag. Vag means the word. So, yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha. So, Upanishadic thinkers believed that there is something, some situation where words cannot go. So, this whole idea, yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha. Yato vacho nivartante. Word stops. Words cannot go there. So that means word cannot go there means you don't have words to say it. This itself is a very interesting thing. Actually, honestly, it was my theme of my PhD dissertation. The one question was only one question, whether there are certain things that you cannot say in language. That was my research question really. Because it's a very interesting thing. Are there certain things that you cannot say in language? Is there any knowledge? Can you call it a knowledge? Can you say that you know something but there are no words to say that? Why can't we coin a word for that if you don't have existing language? There are these interesting things, but this non-conceptual knowledge is not a new thing actually. In the Upanishadic period, of course, at least more than 25 centuries old knowledge, they have this concept. So the rejection of theories, the T is itself is the means by which Buddha is led to the non-conceptual knowledge of the Absolute. So in the Absolute you have non-conceptual knowledge. Not vice versa. What does it mean not vice versa? Vice versa is a Latin term. It's not the other way around. In other words, the Buddha came to non-conceptual knowledge by rejecting all the views. But it is not by non-conceptual knowledge you reject all views, but the other way around. That is what's called vice versa. So in this context, vice versa is that. It is no accident then that Buddha concerns himself with an analysis of the various theories of reality and rejects them all. So according to T.R.V. Murthy, Buddha analyzes all views on reality and rejects them all. Buddha ascends from the conflict of reason to the inexpressibility of the Absolute. So conflict in reason, and then you ascend, you transcend, you go beyond it to the inexpressibility of the Absolute. So the one is the conflict of reasoning. Reason cannot do anything there. Then ultimately what happens is inexpressibility of the Absolute. The position is that Absolute is inexpressible. Now, in other words, what it means is, if you cannot reach by anything logic, then the best thing is you better keep your mouth shut. That means, you can't talk about it. So the silence really, according to T.R.V. Murthy, when you read, you have to understand this. According to T.R.V. Murthy, Buddha's silence is because Buddha knew that through logical argument you cannot reach it. So therefore Buddha kept silent. Inexpressibility of the Absolute. So the Absolute here in this context is Nirvana. So Nirvana as the Absolute, Buddha was silent about it. So the conflict in reasoning and inexpressible Absolute. The consciousness of the conflict in reason and the attempt to resolve it by rising to a plane higher than reason is dialectic. Now there he gives a definition to this word dialectic. Now this again is a very interesting term when we try to understand this Murthy's text. He talks about dialectic. Now what is dialectic according to T.R.V. Murthy? It is the consciousness, it's the awareness of the conflict in reason and the attempt to resolve it by rising to a plane of higher than reason is dialectic. So you are aware of the conflict in reason and you attempt to resolve it by rising to a plane higher than reason. So there are two things. One thing is awareness of conflict in reason. And then second is attempt to resolve it by rising to a plane. Attempt to resolve this conflict by rising to a higher plane than reason. Now this is, according to him, what is called dialectic. Now again, you can look at Wikipedia or you can look at any dictionary and try to understand the meaning of what dialectic is. Dialectic, sometimes called dialectics, or sometimes is called dialectical method. And then Karl Marx philosophy is described as dialectical materialism. In Western philosophy, this idea basically comes from Hegel, who talked about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, that process. So anyhow, study this term deeply. Now, in this context, T.R.V. Murthy says dialectic is born. He is using the term dialectic to say awareness of the conflict in reasoning. So there is a conflict in reasoning because, there are certain things you cannot reach by logical reasoning. And then you try to resolve this conflict by transcending these limits and by rising to it, by reaching a higher level higher than reasoning. So that is according to T.R.V. Murthy's dialectic. So attempt to resolve the conflict by rising to a higher plane. So he says that dialectic. And the dialectical method is the Madhyamika way. Then he identifies this dialectical method is the Madhyamika philosophical method. So you can see, how he interprets, the whole thing. Okay. Again, the Upanishads with one voice speak of the knowledge of the self as the knowledge of all. And this is the sole means of freedom. So again, Upanishads with one voice speak of the knowledge of the self, like Atma Vidya, Atma Jnana, or in Upanishad they say Atmanang Vidhi, know your Atma. So Atma knowledge is the self-knowledge, the knowledge of all. That means if you know Atma, you know all. And this is the sole means of freedom. That is the sole means of freedom, only way to freedom. Atma Jnana, Atma Vidya. They use the word Atma Vidya or they use the word Adhyatma Vidya. In the Upanishad they use the term Adhyatma Vidya or Atma Vidya. Bondage is the ignorance of the self. Bondage is the ignorance of the self. For the Buddha, however, the self is a primary wrong notion. So, for the Buddha, soul is a wrong notion. Buddha does not speak of the knowledge of any specific entity as the saving knowledge. For him, the awareness of the nature of pain, that means dukkha, and it is cause, samudaya, is itself the knowledge which sets man free. So for the Buddha, it is the knowledge of dukkha, and samudaya is the one that makes human being free. Times out of number, we are told that Buddha knows what is pain. Times out of number, what does that mean? In simple language, times out of number, we are told. That is one way to say in many times. Okay, times out of number means in many times. This reading T.R.V. Murthy is a very beautiful writer, that's why I thought even for the sake of English, this is a very nice reading. So times out of number means many times we are told that Buddha knows what is pain, how it arises, how it ceases, etc. This can only mean that for him, knowledge is the self-conscious awareness of the world process. So for the Buddha, knowledge is the self-conscious awareness. Awareness and the self-conscious awareness. Do you see a difference between? For him, knowledge is the awareness of the world process. For him, the knowledge is the self-conscious awareness of the process. What is the difference? What is the difference? Do you see any difference, or is just a usage of two more words without no reason? Self-conscious awareness. We can simply read, for him, knowledge is the awareness of the world process. We can say for the Buddha, knowledge is the awareness of the world process. But then Murthy says, self-conscious awareness of the world process. What is the awareness and the self-conscious awareness? When you have awareness, you have some knowledge. But what does it mean to say that self-conscious awareness? No. Actually, awareness is something you already have. Awareness. You are aware. Self-conscious means, I think it means you are aware of awareness. Self-conscious aware. You not only know, you know that you know. Exactly. You not only know, you not only aware, you are aware that you are aware. Pardon me? No, thing is this, sometimes we know that, but we don't know that we know it. Now here the thing is, you know it, you know that you know it. So it's a different level of knowledge about knowledge. We can say second order knowledge. First order knowledge is you know something. Second order knowledge is you know that you know it. I mean, we can go higher. You know that you know that you know it. You know, so on and so forth. But I don't know, but it looks like one way to construe that would be self-aware, self-conscious awareness means you are aware of your awareness. Times out or number, we are told that Buddha knows what is pain, how it arises, how it ceases, etc. This can only mean that for him knowledge is a self-conscious awareness of the world process. To realize inexorability of the causal law. Inexorability of the causal law. What is the inexorability? Inexorability. Causal law. That means you can never escape from the causal law. Inexorability. It happens no matter what. So inexorable. That means you cannot alter. You cannot change it. It has to happen. So that is what inexorable. Inexorability of the causal law, pratitya samutpada, is to stand aside from it. This can only mean that for him knowledge is the self-conscious awareness of the world process. To realize the inexorability of the causal law is to stand aside it. So to Buddha, causal law is inexorable. So what the Buddha did was, Buddha went beyond that. I mean, he is not subject to causal law. Or the nirvana is not subject to causal law, because causal law is inexorable. It can't be changed. So that when you transcend this, you go beyond that. Anyhow, this is how he interprets this. Freedom is the knowledge of necessity. Freedom of the knowledge of necessity. Freedom means you know that there are certain things that have to happen no matter what. Necessity. Necessity is again a very interesting concept in philosophy and also in science. Necessity means there are certain things that have to happen. You know, nobody can prevent it. You know, so something like that. So again, do some reading on these things, because, you know, these concepts are very, very interesting and very heavy concept. Freedom is the knowledge of necessity. It is an attitude of withdrawal. It is an attitude of withdrawal. Like, withdrawal means you withdraw from the process. Either you can become a part of process and undergo the inexorable law of pratitya samutpada, or you can get aside from the process and then, you withdraw from that. Avidya is ignorance of the nature of pain, etc. It is a natural but unconscious attachment to things. Buddha's conception of reflective awareness of things as the saving knowledge is the Madhyamika notion of Shunyata or Prajna. Now ultimately, Murti connects Buddha's Prajna into Mula Madhyamika Karika's Shunyata. So avidya is the ignorance of the pain. It is a natural but unconscious attachment. Buddha's conception of reflective awareness of things. Reflective awareness of things. Maybe something like Vipassana or Vidarshana is a saving knowledge, is the Madhyamika notion of Shunyata or Prajna. So this is the, it might be asked, somebody could ask the following question. If the Buddha had no theory of his own, how is it that he appears to have suggested the theory of elements, Skandha Dhatu Ayatana, at very many places in his dialogues? Now, he goes to a different aspect. Somebody can ask, if the Buddha did not have, now he described Buddha as rejecting all views. Then somebody can ask, okay, if the Buddha rejected all views, if he did not have his own view, how come that Buddha talks about Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana? He kind of suggested the theory of elements. Element means Dhatu. At very many places in his dialogue. So Buddha's discourses, many places refer to Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana. To suggest, as is done by some scholars, that the Skandha doctrine is a later scholastic elaboration of the monks is to shelve the question. What is the shelve the question? Shelve the question. Now, some people answer this question by saying that Buddha did not teach Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana. The Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana is a later formulation by monks. Now, Murti says that that answer is to shelve the question. Shelving means you escaping from the question. You hide the question. You are not facing the question. So, now the question is, how come there is Skandha Dhatu Ayatana, the references in the discourses? Some people answer that question by saying that, well, Buddha did not teach Skandha Dhatu Ayatana. It is some later creation by the monks. But T.R.V. Murti says that no, if you give that answer, that is to shelve the question. Shelving means you covering the question, you avoiding the question, you escaping from the question. So he doesn't accept that. We must accept that the Buddha did formulate such a doctrine. So he says that we must accept that Buddha formulated such a doctrine. The passages are too numerous and the tradition too weighty to be ignored. Now you see, the passages are too numerous to ignore. Too numerous and too heavy. The passages are too numerous. There are so many passages referring to Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana. And they are too weighty. Those passages are very, very powerful evidence, too weighty to be ignored. So they are too weighty to be ignored. You can't ignore them. They are very substantial. On our interpretation, according to his, is the doctrine of element was necessary as a preliminary step. So Murti thinks that actually Buddha taught Skandha Dhatu Ayatana, but he had to teach it because it was necessary as a preliminary. It was not the ultimate teaching, but as a preliminary thing. If there had been only the substance view, Atmavada, in the field, the Buddha could not have been led to the dialectical consciousness. So what he says is, if there was only the Atmavada, then that will not lead to what he attributes to the Buddha is dialectical consciousness. A model view too was necessary. A model view too was necessary. Actually, again, refer to the dictionary to understand the model view. Now, model view means it comes from mod, model. Model here means the adjective. But what it means, it has many meanings. Actually, it has a very scientific, very technological meanings also. But the model meaning here is some view providing the background for the other view. So the modal view is the some kind of view as the mode to provide the higher stage. Now, if Buddha had only the Atma view, then he says that Buddha could not develop dialectical consciousness. So, in order to do that, Buddha had to dismantle the Atma view into Skandha Dhatu Ayatana. And from that view, of course, dialectical consciousness, as he thinks, the real Buddha's view comes. So the Skandha Dhatu Ayatana view, according to T.R.V. Murthy, is a modal view. Modal view means it is some kind of preparatory view. But don't think the meaning of the word modal is preparatory only every place. But in this context, it is the basic preparatory things. But basically modal means something related to the mode or form, not to the substance. That is the meaning of the word. But of course it has so many different meanings. A modal view too was necessary. A thesis had to be opposed by a counter thesis before there could emerge dialectical consciousness. Now the thesis is, if you say Atma view, then it has to have a counter thesis. Now counter thesis, according to T.R.V. Murthy's Skandha Dhatu Ayatana theory. Thesis had to be opposed by a counter thesis before there could emerge the dialectical consciousness. Then alone could there be a conflict in reason and the attempt to transcend it. So now if you take Atma view as the thesis, without antithesis you cannot have a dialectical view. So what, in other words, T.R.V. Murthy says is, in the discourses there is so much reference to the Buddha's teachings on Skandha Dhatu Ayatana. So you cannot deny it, like some other scholars do. So what he says is Buddha did it on the purpose. The purpose is first to dismantle the Atma view. So it's a kind of modal view in between. But that is not the real view of the Buddha, according to Murthy. He uses it only as a step and then of course going to create what he wanted to create. So he says that a thesis had to be opposed by a counter thesis. So if you have a thesis, that thesis has to be opposed by a counter thesis before there could emerge a dialectical consciousness. Then alone could there be a conflict in reason and attempt to transcend it. Now, of course, only when you have thesis and antithesis, then that is as far as the reasoning would lead. Now, so beyond these two ends, you cannot come out. Then, of course, you have to leave behind the reasoning and go beyond it. Now, reasoning has led you to these two extremes. Now, in order to come out of these two extremes, you cannot use reasoning. This is what Murthy says. In order for that, you have to transcend it. Now, in that transcending process, what he considers to be the dialectical method is arisen. Do you see that point? So, the Atma in the Buddhist histories, according to T.R.V. Murthy, is we say philosophical view which the Buddha wanted to oppose. So you have on the one hand Atma view. Opposed to it we have elements, Dhatu view. Now this is we can say according to Murthy thesis, and this is what is called antithesis. Okay. Now thesis and antithesis. Now this is you come here through reason. Okay. Through reason you come here. Okay. What happens is this is a dead end and this is a dead end. So we can say this is a dead end. Can't go beyond that. Reason has brought here and here, but reason can't come out. So now what Murthy says is, we have to go beyond this. Ultimately, you go beyond this. So this is what the dialectic means. So through this process, I mean, you don't go according to the reasoning anymore, because reasoning has taken you to where it can take you. So go beyond that is the, the dialectic according to T.R.V. Murthy. Anyhow, first it is important for you to understand what Murthy says, okay? And then you can, if you want to critique it, but, read carefully, how he comes to his view. So, the thesis had to be opposed by a counter thesis before there could emerge a dialectical consciousness. Then alone could there be a conflict in reason and the attempt to transcend it. As a matter of dialectical necessity, then did the Buddha formulate or at least suggest a theory of element. So you can see his answer. As a matter of dialectical necessity. So only in Mahayana Buddhist language we can say it is a upaya kaushalya of the Buddha. To come up with Skandha Dhatu Ayatana is only a upaya kaushalya. It's not really there, but as a means. So as a matter of dialectical necessity, because it is needed in order for this process, then Buddha formulate or at least suggest a theory of elements. The Mahayana system clearly recognizes this dialectical necessity when they speak of the Pudgala Nairatmata, denial of substance, as intended to pave the way for absolutism. So the Mahayana talks about Pudgala Nairatmata, the denial of substance, as intended to pave the way to absolutism. But I don't know why he did not talk about Dharma Nairatmata. Not only Pudgala Nairatmata, Mahayana has Dharma Nairatmata. Actually what he said is, like in the history of Buddhism, Buddha pointed to the Pudgala Nairatmata. But then followers of the Buddha like Sarvastivadins came out with the Dharma theory. But then comes, the idea of Dharma Nairatmata. Now that is what the Nagarjuna does. Nagarjuna says not only Pudgala is Nairatmya, Dharma is also Nairatmya. But then, actually it is not purely Nagarjuna's view. We know that when the Buddha says, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta is Dharma Nairatmata anyway, right? So it is not only Mulamadhyami Nagarjuna. But of course, T.R.V. Murthy doesn't mention here, he says Pudgala Nairatmata as intended to pave the way for absolutism. Shunyata is the unreality of the elements as well as, Dharma Nairatmata as well. So ultimately Shunyata is the unreality of everything. So not only Pudgala is unreal but also Dharma. Modern Buddhist scholars like Kimura, who are in touch with the living Buddhist tradition, also speak in the same strain. So he refers to Kimura. That is number one. Footnote. Historically, it must be said that the Buddha preached his phenomenological doctrines in an exoteric form to the people, and his ontological doctrine in the esoteric form was reserved only for the advanced, brilliant men. Teachings on both these lines proceeded simultaneously without implying any periodical or chronological division. However, from the doctrinal point of view, the former is the more expedient upaya doctrine, while the latter is the real doctrine. So the former is the upaya, like when the Buddha talked about Pudgala Nairatmata, but the latter is the real doctrine. This order equates well with the inherent natural law in the spiritual domain. Here the former or exoteric must come first, and the latter esoteric would come next. Now this is the term Hinayana and Mahayana by this person called Kimura. Again, the T.R.V. Murthy is quoting in support of his view. But, okay, we are at the end of that section. Before proceeding, I would like to open for some discussion if you have any questions. Any questions or any comments, or everything is crystal clear or what? Yes. To begin with. Okay. That's okay. That's okay. Okay, last paragraph or last page? 50? What page is that? Okay. Model. Yeah. So what is that? Is it not clear? Okay. I thought you were trying to ask the question. I didn't know that you already asked the question. Okay, all right. Actually, the model view is what he considers to be model view. The word model is very difficult word to define because it has thousands of meanings. But here it means the view, not really the real view, but the view by way of providing the basis for the next view. So in other words, what he says is Buddha could not jump from Atma doctrine to what he called dialectic. Because Atma doctrine is the thesis, then Atma doctrine has to have antithesis. So what he says is Buddha, in order to go beyond this Atma view, Buddha created the antithesis. But antithesis created only for that purpose. That's why Murti called this a model view. In other words, not because Buddha accepted the Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana, but simply Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana as antithesis to Atma. So you have Atma view as the thesis, and then Skandha Dhatu Ayatana as antithesis. Then from putting together thesis and antithesis, then Buddha transcendent, going to the, So this Buddha did as an expedient, upaya. Actually, I said that, used that word, and then Murti refers to this author called Kimura. Kimura is really using that word. He is saying the Skandha Dhatu Ayatana teaching is a kind of upaya. Now this upaya kaushalya concept in Mahayana, if you are not familiar with that very much, idea is that Buddha taught certain things only as means to convey some ideas, not necessarily because they were true. Upaya kaushalya means skill in means. Now this is one of the central ideas in Mahayana tradition. So particularly when they want to say Mahayana is the highest teaching, they say Buddha also taught Hinayana. But Buddha taught Hinayana only as a means to some lower people. For them to be upgraded, Buddha taught Hinayana. But ultimately Hinayana is not true. So why did the Buddha teach? Only as upaya. Means of upgrading them. Yeah. So upaya. Upaya means skillful means. So according to, this view is something like that. So Buddha, the T.R.V. Murti doesn't use the word upaya himself. What he says is, it is a model view. Model view means some kind of preparatory view to reject the Atma theory. So in order to reject Atma theory, Buddha formulated the Skandha Dhatu Ayatana, but he didn't believe in that. It was just a model. Model in the sense, some kind of step towards the thing he wanted to achieve.
According to this writer?
Pardon me?
According to him?
Yeah.
Because of the Atman, to reject the Atman?
Yeah.
Yeah. Buddha formulate his view.
Exactly.
The element.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Not necessarily.
Yes. So Buddha did not really accept Skandha Dhatu Ayatana view according to him. But this is one way of reading the history. But actually Buddhist scholarship has ever, because Murti wrote this book in 1950s, but after that, K.N. Jaitilaka has a critique on this book, Kalupana has critiqued on this Murti's book, I myself have critiqued this book. So, there are many other writers who have come after that and, commented on Murti's view. But then, nevertheless, still it is very important to see how Murti, develops his thesis. Okay.
So, on the base 49, the Buddha's conception of relative awareness of things and the saving knowledge.
Where are you?
49.
49 top or what?
Yeah, the second paragraph.
Okay.
And the end of the paragraph. So the Buddha's conception of
Reflective awareness of things.
It means so it means the mindfulness.
It looks like vipassana or something.
And seven knowledge is mean
Knowledge that
at the beginning the knowledge is still young, and step by step the mutual knowledge, and when the highest knowledge, maybe we get enlightenment, like something like that.
Yeah, actually the Murthy is using here the popular religious language, saving knowledge. But in Buddhism, we cannot talk about the savior. But when you talk about religion in general, they use this term. So saving knowledge is something like vipassana jnana. So it is through vipassana jnana you achieve final nirvana.
Yeah.
So, but we don't really know what this Buddha's concept, reflective awareness of things. Now, what is reflective awareness of things? I think it is the vipassana. Vipassana. So vipassana is the saving knowledge. So knowledge of anicca dukkha anatta is the one that saves you, that gives you liberation from samsara. So maybe that is what he means by that.
Saving knowledge.
Yeah.
In the Buddhism, we have the sitting kind of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean but ultimately what leads to nirvana is what he means by that. Don't go by the term saving knowledge very much, because that's a saving knowledge is a popular term in religion. Now, God is a savior. But if you take Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, there is no God, but knowledge is the savior there. So, you have to understand, T.R.E. Murthy's Advaita Vedanta in philosopher. So his language is, also nuanced by, his understanding of Advaita Vedanta. Yeah, so although it talks about saving knowledge, it's not strictly talking about the savior or anything, but simply knowledge that ultimately saves you from samsara. It's something like that. Yeah.
Can we say,
Yeah.
in Mahayana philosophy, the position of Amitabha or eternal Buddha are included because they do understand the sign of Buddha on this particular question. Can we say like that?
Do you mean the connection between Avyakruta questions and the eternal Buddha? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because the
How do you connect? How do you?
of the Buddha.
Reverend, I don't see a connection between the two. Avyakruta questions and eternal Buddha concept is somewhat more recent, really. That concept was developed particularly in the Sukhavati Vyuha tradition, and then, Amitabha Buddha and all that. I mean, I do not see a connection between Buddha's Avyakruta questions, unanswered questions and that, because eternal Buddha thing developed from somewhat different concerns. For example, particularly in the Japanese history and East Asian tradition, they ultimately came to a belief that, people cannot really meditate, people cannot really achieve nirvana on their own, like as it is said in the early Buddhist tradition. They said, we are in the degenerative period. They use the word in Japanese language, mappo, M-A-P-P-O, mappo. Mappo means degenerative period. So in the degenerative period, they said that you can't attain nirvana by your power. So they wanted to other power. So this distinction, jiriki and tariki. So your own power, they said, no, you can't attain anymore. This is a very bad period. So you need help of the other. Other means help of the Buddha. So finally, Buddha is made to be a savior. And if the Buddha is savior, he can't attain parinirvana. He has to be there forever. These are the concerns finally came into the view of, eternal Buddha in the Mahayana tradition. So that is connected with the Mahayana, East Asian Mahayana history, society, and many things. So that we need to look at separately, because it is a historical development. Yeah. Why don't we stop at this point for today, and then we will read the last section next week, okay? And then, so, thank you very much. See you again. Okay, that's right, thank you.